Right. So thanks very much for taking the time to have this interview today. I think it'll be really interesting for the students to hear a bit about your work. So to start off, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and the lab that you work in and the kind of work that you do?
So I work in the Department of Electrical and Electronic Engineering here at the university. So my background is in low power circuit design. So making the electronics that goes into devices from mobile phones, TVs, those sort of things, and decreasing the power consumption so you can increase the battery life. And I've always done that inside a medical context. So looking at what we would call wearables today and trying to improve the electronics so that they've got more functionality, better performance.
Right. Yep. Okay. So you've already mentioned a few key things like functionality and performance, battery life. So what do you think are the main challenges when using these kind of wearable sensor nodes to measure aspects of health like heart rate or gait?
Yeah. So there's quite a lot of factors which still need better performance, more research, improvement. Not least is the accuracy of the devices.
Right.
If you look at, say, step count algorithms, do they work for different parts of the population? Is the accuracy plus or minus 1%, plus or minus 10%? And the same applies to heart rate monitoring and all of those sorts of factors.
Yeah.
Because for a lot of our wearable devices, they're designed and sold as kind of health and wellness devices rather than as medical devices. And they have very different requirements in terms of the level of accuracy.
Right.
My background is in kind of electronics and power consumption, so there's still a lot of work going on into improving the battery life of devices. That's got a lot better over recent years. There's some research grade units today that are getting up to like a year of battery life without ever having to recharge it. But of course, as soon as we add more battery capacity, lower power electronics, simultaneously we're adding in more functionality. We're aiming to do more sensing, more processing of the data. So there's this constant battle going on there. And then there's also big challenges in terms of getting them into the kind of health ecosystem. So the standard model today is that you've got your wearable device and it transmits data to a cloud, and then you can see some summarized results on your phone, and potentially you can go and show those to whoever you like.
Yep.
That's very different to a device which is integrated into the NHS, which is prescribed potentially for you to use, that the doctors have access to the data from, and so on.
Okay, so so you mentioned getting the data into the health ecosystem. Would that include, for example, sending it into electronic health records?
Potentially, yes.
Yeah. Okay, very interesting. Okay, and you've also done some work on using conformable or stretchable electronics, which can be attached to the skin in a tattoo-like manner. Could you tell us a little bit more about this kind of work?
Yeah, so this forms a big part of my research portfolio, where it's less about decreasing the power consumption of the electronics, but increasing the usability, the form factor, the social discreteness of them. So I see some examples? Maybe that would be. So when we talk about electronics that we make today, we make them on rigid circuit boards. If you take apart your Fitbit, say, or your phone or your computer, you'll get something that looks like this inside. And it's just limiting in terms of how small it can be, how well it can fit around the curves on your body, and so on. And so what we're looking at are flexible electronics that will do better than that. So we've got an example here, which is on a plastic substrate. One of these ports connects to ECG electrodes for measuring heart rate, and the other one is just for debugging purposes. We don't actually use it. Right. And again, in terms of the flexibility, in terms of where you could put that on the body, it's much more wearable than this. And of course, this is a work in progress. So this project is funded in 3 stages. The second stage is looking at, we've got this battery holder here. And of course, that's the biggest, that's the most inflexible part. So we're looking at printing flexible batteries to replace that. And then in the longer term, we have examples where the electronics is being integrated into the kind of textile substrate itself. So here we've got, these are a graphene-based ink, very flexible, just a part of the fabric itself. And here we've got, these are standard clips, again, to connect to ECG recording instrumentation. So as long as this is close to your body, it doesn't need to touch it, it will still pick up an ECG signal. And of course there's work to do to take this kind of electronics, mount it here, but we can already do all of the interconnects, it's just the component mounting bit that comes next.
So these are potentially things that would be much easier to incorporate into someone's everyday life, I suppose, because rather than having to wear some sort of bulky, uncomfortable device and having to remember it, these are things that you could quite easily include in everyday life.
Exactly. And there's always lots of debate about this. So if you look at hearing aids, half of kind of my research area argue that they're very well socially accepted. You can put a lot of electronics behind the ear. You get to a certain point in life where basically everyone you know is using one. On the flip side, we know that about 40% of people who would benefit from a hearing aid don't use one. People delay using one by about 10 years, is the estimate, for fear of looking old. And the same sort of question marks have come for all of these kind of body-worn electronics. Perhaps less so for some of the kind of wrist-worn ones, because people are used to wearing stuff at the wrist. So I think over the next 10 to 15 years, one of the big pushes is going to be to make these kind of really invisible. So from the research space, we have a question mark of, is a wearable, like on your wrist, is that passive sensing? You know, is it just sensing that you're doing anyway because you have a device on and you're getting data? Or is it kind of semi-active because you're choosing to put it on? But as we move towards these things integrated maybe into shoes, which you just put on and it starts going, or just into your clothing, then it becomes much more passive. The fact you've got your cardigan, say in your case, on, means you're doing some sensing and getting data collection. You're not burdening the person.
And I guess with these kind of newer developments where it's actually like a tattoo that can be attached to the skin, that would be even less, or it'll be even more passive sensing, I would imagine.
I think we would tend to view this kind of smart textiles type thing as the step beyond the tattoo type stuff. Because again, the tattoo type stuff is something that you're going to have to actively choose to put on. Whereas you're putting your t-shirt on just because you're going out of the house.
Okay. So your lab also does work on closed loop simulation. Could you maybe talk us through what that is and what it's used for?
So when we're looking at wearable devices, what we tend to say is that there are 3 avenues we're trying to advance. So one of them is about the electronics itself, so making them more flexible, more wearable, as we've just been speaking about. The second aspect is looking at not just collecting data, but doing something with that. And we're particularly interested in doing it in real time, essentially. So we would be looking at collecting your data, seeing whether a particular event has happened or not, typically within 10, 20 milliseconds, and then doing something as a result of that.
Some sort of intervention, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. So we have a project with the University of Cardiff at the moment where we use wearable EEG, it's called. So we put electrodes on the head and we measure people's brain activity while they sleep. And when you sleep, there's a characteristic feature called a slow oscillation. And if you play a sound at the person, so it's just a bit of white noise, at the peak of a slow oscillation, you can trigger another slow oscillation. And the number of slow oscillations you have is highly correlated with your memory consolidation performance. And so you can start to use the fact that you're not just recording data, you're recording, detecting very quickly with an SO, and then playing a sound, in our case, in order to affect the person.
Right, and so that kind of thing might actually help people consolidate their memory better?
There's an awful lot of work to do,
Yeah.
but that's the research direction, yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And of course, this is just one of many different aspects of that sort of closed loop system.
Yeah.
So you might be familiar with the artificial pancreas, where you measure insulin levels in the body.
Yeah.
So you measure glucose levels in the body, and then release insulin in order to maintain the levels for people with type 1 diabetes.
Yeah.
That's really the forerunner of all of these sorts of closing the loop. And there's lots of stuff today about, say, deep brain stimulation, doing a closed loop, muscle stimulation for paralysis, doing it in closed loop.
Yeah. So I guess this would be something that could, again, it could be a lot more passive rather than people having to actively do something. It could just sort of happen in the background.
Yeah, I think at the moment a lot of our systems rely on some form of kind of closed loop sense actuate, and it's you doing the actuation.
Yeah.
So, if you imagine automating the release of a drug, so it gets you don't get a reminder on your phone. It says 6 o'clock.
Yeah.
Take your whatever medication it is, please. That's relying on you closing the loop, taking it.
Yeah.
Whereas in principle, you could release that drug automatically.
Yeah.
There's lots of work going, not in my lab, but in terms of transdermal release and so on. And again, triggering that based only on the time is quite straightforward. The challenge is more to detect when will your body optimally respond to it, and using that as the trigger.
That's quite interesting. I imagine then it would also help people to feel less burdened by their disease and feel less reminded that they're ill every day.
That's an interesting point. That tends to be not how we describe it. We tend to describe it from an optimization point of view. But that's an interesting thought to.
Yeah, I'm thinking of it from a psychologist's point of view. So we mentioned earlier already some of your work on integrating data from sensors with electronic health records. I was wondering if you could explain a little bit more on why that would be useful.
Yeah. So this is the third aspect of my research portfolio, and it's really around all aspects of kind of automated analysis, machine learning, and so on. Because the ultimate goal of a lot of these kind of wearable type technologies is to get them into a care system so that you can have some effect. Yeah. And the one which we're working towards, and again, this is a long-term goal, but it's the one of kind of optimizing resources. So we've got use cases in chronic kidney disease and in serious mental illness, where the current care plans would have you go and see your doctor at regular intervals. And of course, that doesn't use any information that we have about how you actually are.
Right.
And we know for the case of schizophrenia, for example, that if you intervene at the right point before somebody relapses, you can help avoid relapse from occurring. Yeah. But if you just have those regular scheduled meetings with your clinician or your carer or whatever, you don't necessarily get that. What you want is to use the fact that we can get information to target the resources to when you want to do it. Of course, that's much easier said than done, and it's got an interesting kind of risk analysis case. But that's where we're pushing towards. Yeah. And we've this is part of a big project which is tackling it from a few different angles. But one of those angles is starting from the care pathway. Most care pathways today are written in a PDF document in text. So firstly, you've got to put those into a computer form and a computer executable form. Then you've got to get the data as a part of that care pathway. And then you've got to look at, okay, how do you make that pathway executable so that depending on the data, you start to go different routes. And so we're working up a demo on a very small part of a care pathway to illustrate the principle. Yeah.
So it's still quite early days, this kind of research.
Yeah, I think there's just an awful lot of factors that have got to be taken into account simultaneously. Yeah. So on that project, we've got people from electronic engineering who are doing the actual wearable device. We've got people from computer science. We've got people from healthcare data analytics. NICE is one of our project partners. We've got people doing the safety case and the health economics case at the same time. And there's a lot of things that you've got to get right before you can do anything more than the quite straightforward example.
Yeah, that sounds very promising though. So maybe one last question. What developments do you think we can look for in the future?
So I think it's, as we've touched on, very much this move to much more kind of passive sensing rather than me choosing to put on a device. And we've done focus groups with people from a wide range of backgrounds. You get all manner of different thoughts about people's willingness to put on devices.
Yeah.
And just that shift to much more pervasive. It's embedded in the sole of your shoe, for example.
Yeah.
We've got a project looking at self-powered sensors placed in shoes. So you don't even need to worry about the batteries.
Right.
It powers itself by the fact you're walking in it. And all of it just becomes much more invisible and pervasive. And then multimodal. So we get much more information with regards to what's actually going on rather than just accelerometry, say, which we get at the moment.
Yeah. Great. Well, that was really interesting. Thank you very much for taking the time for this.
Okay, thank you.